Canada's foremost environmentalist and CBC darling, David Suzuki, is back with some fresh life advice for the rest of us. Eat bugs. I say, let them eat steak. Dr. Fruit Fly David Suzuki has a new op-ed in the Huffington Post. It has the usual doomsday cultish warnings you'd expect from a far left-wing environmentalist article. But let me just read a little bit of it to you so you truly understand how gross and unhinged radical tree huggers really are. Although vegetarian diets would suffice to feed humans and drastically reduce our environmental footprint, meat consumption remains a firmly established tradition. But if we bartered beef, pork, or chicken for a handful of insects, the environmental impact of our animal protein intake would drop dramatically. According to the FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, of course the United Nations, 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions are linked to animal husbandry. Emissions from insect production are negligible in relation to the amount of protein produced. Insects are especially effective at converting their food because they're cold-blooded and therefore waste less energy to keep warm. You got that? Want to save the Earth from an impending CO2-induced inferno that actually never seems to happen? Eat a maggot. Speaking of maggots, Suzuki is an expert on maggots, and he thinks we're all just maggots in one form or another. Just watch.
One thing that I've gotten off on lately is that basically, you know, I study fruit flies, and I suddenly realized that basically we're all fruit flies.
But going back to the ridiculous contention that I should be replacing my steak for a bottle fly or a mealworm, do we really think Suzuki himself would replace his tofu for a cricket? I don't. I suspect neither does he. In the very same article, Suzuki gives himself a bit of an out. It reads, "To reduce our environmental footprint, not everyone needs to incorporate these crisp, delicious arthropods into their diet. Changing the diet of farmed animals could also help. People who may not want to ingest insects themselves would likely have little problem feeding their pets insect-containing kibble or eating farmed animals like chickens raised on insect-based feeds." Okay, let's read between the lines here. Those people who can afford to pay more for specialty-fed chicken or dog food, like Suzuki can avoid eating grasshoppers. This is along the same vein as politicians buying a carbon credit to offset their air travel. You don't actually have to do the thing you want others to do to save the carbon from their air travel. You can just claim to save the Earth without changing behaviors as long as you can afford to pay more for the indulgence of it all. Now, I'm willing to bet Suzuki's the kind of guy who wouldn't lower himself to eat a hot dog, but he wants the rest of us to live off a diet of bugs. He's a hypocrite. Suzuki spent decades telling us the world is overpopulated, saying in an interview in 2010 that we are consuming over 80% of the planet's resources, even though we're only 20% of the world's population. We are the major predator on the planet. And then Suzuki said humanity is on the edge of a major cull. But Suzuki, well, he's got 5 kids himself. Suzuki spent those same decades telling us all to use less resources to avoid that cull of humankind and to expend less carbon in our daily lives. Yet he has several houses, one of which is in Australia. He literally has to circumnavigate the globe on a jet to get to it. But you, well, you have to eat bugs like a human seagull to save the Earth. The left are just fine with people who live one way and preach another, as long as that same person is a good spokesman for their side. And saying Suzuki is a good spokesperson is really, up for debate, given how he treated researcher Vivian Krause. She claims she was treated very poorly by David Suzuki in the past. He allegedly told her to F off in a public place when she tried to introduce herself. Twice. "You're the fish farmer," he said. I had barely begun to explain that yes, I used to work in fish farming 7 years ago. But before I could say much, Dr. Suzuki looked me straight in the eye and started telling me to F off. Not just once. Then suddenly he seemed to catch himself and quickly sat down. Now, if an oil company executive had treated, let's say, Environment Minister Catherine McKenna in that very same way, the progressives would be picketing outside of his house. Suzuki and the fact that he's still considered a serious environmentalist, despite all of his blatant hypocrisy, says a lot about the principles of the left, as in they don't seem to have any outside of wanting to control our lives. For the Rebel.media, I'm Sheila Gunn-Reid. I've got some really exciting news for people like me who basically live on their phone and mobile devices. The Rebel has a brand new app. Just go to your app store, Apple or Android, and download the Rebel Media app and take us with you wherever you go.